May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Well, good morning. Are you ready to go on a journey this morning? Are you ready? Oh, yeah, you're ready. I heard you back here. So let's hop in a time machine. We're going to hop in a time machine this morning, okay? And we're going to go back in time a little bit. We're going to go back past Christmas of 1943, which is the picture that you see there on the front of your service leaflet. That's here, Christmas of 1943. We're going to go back past that. We're going to go 100 years ago, Armistice Day on November the 11th, 1918. We're going to go past that. We're going to go back about 50 more years past that to early in the year in 1861 in Knoxville, Tennessee. St. John's Church was here in Knoxville, not quite on this site. It didn't quite look like this. It was just a couple of blocks away, but it was here in Knoxville, Tennessee. In 1861, in the winter, as it was cold, the newspapers revealed a very divisive society with increasingly fractured news. Lots of individually fractured news reports. One pull quote read, "Do not vote for ill-tempered men with war in their hearts." That was from the Knoxville Register. And you saw lots of editorials, and there was a lot of strife and dissent in a deeply divided community. And as spring blossomed, it became apparent that true division was on the horizon. You know, in this pulpit was the Reverend Thomas Humes. Right here, the Reverend Thomas Humes. If you squint, you can see him better there. It's a pixel quilt. The Reverend Thomas Humes. He was in this pulpit. And just as the country was starting to feel like there was a real rift opening up and dividing, he wrote and reflected on the third Sunday of Easter and the readings of the third Sunday of Easter on Sunday, April the 21st in 1861. It was just over a week after the opening salvo of the attack on Fort Sumter. And he said, you know, our readings are appointed for that Sunday. They had the election. They were already appointed, lectionary. And the readings for that Sunday began with the 9th verse of the 3rd chapter of the prophet Joel. These words, he said, "Proclaim ye this among the Gentiles. Prepare war. Wake up the mighty men. Let all the men of war draw near. Let them come up. Beat your plowshares into swords and your pruning hooks into spears. Let the weak say, I am strong." But he said that wasn't the only lection that morning. There was another. There was from the words in the epistle for that Sunday, which was from St. Peter's first letter. And in that one it said, "Submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether it be as to the king supreme or unto governors, as unto them that are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers, and for the praise of them that do well. For so is the will of God. For brethren, ye have been called unto liberty. Only use not liberty for an occasion to the flesh, but by love serve one another." And in Hume's own reflection, he says that it felt like after that Sunday, everyone came away from St. John's hearing the words they were already inclined to have heard when they entered. Tennessee was deeply divided. It was deeply divided at that time. And as the summer heated up, so did the tensions. They got more and more tense. You see, Humes was a loyalist, and he knew the power of our prayers, right? So in the prayers of the people, he continued to pray for the leaders of the United States of America. Even after Jefferson Davis had called for a Confederate Day of Prayer, and other churches around us had started changing that to the Confederated States of America, Humes stuck with it. And you know what? The congregation was divided. Not everyone liked that. Not by a long shot. In fact, this is preserved in the diaries of a 20-year-old woman, Ellen House. She's a little bit of a hothead who loved to speak her mind. We know in her diaries. I like to think of her sitting out there like near like where Jenny Rogers used to sit, right over there, or maybe she sits over here near Anna Ottaviano. You know, she's an empowered woman who would speak her mind. And here's what she said of the good Reverend Humes when he did not pray for the Confederated States. She called him the grandest old rascal that ever was. Yes, yes. And so as the summer wore on and his tensions literally got hot, Humes later amended the prayer to read, "To those in authority." But it wasn't enough. By the end of the summer, he had resigned from his pulpit. That's right. He had literally left and had to step down from the church. And he was, like a lot of other sort of loyalist Union preachers, on his way, headed up to the north for the war, when he broke his hip. So he got stuck in Knoxville. So he stayed in Knoxville throughout that time, and St. John's struggled to continue to pray together. They brought a priest in from Lenoir City, although there were times that it was hard to pray. Sometimes morning prayer when they couldn't get a priest, and then there were other times that the strife around us was so much that they couldn't even gather at all. It was a hard time. You know, I got interested in the Civil War about 8 years ago when my little 5-year-old started asking me a lot of questions. 5-year-olds will do that, won't they? They'll ask really good questions. And one of the questions he used to ask is, "Mom, why is Dad's hospital called Fort Sanders? It doesn't look like a fort, it looks like a hospital, right? If you've ever seen it? Good question." So I started asking around. I started stopping. Whenever we saw one of those beautiful gray signs, I would stop and I would say, "Look, a hysterical marker." And I would stop and read it to him, you know. So in our quest to learn more together about the history of the Civil War in Knoxville, Tennessee, we went to visit a good friend. Some of you may know this friend. We went to visit the good Dr. Paul Bergeron, historian from Tennessee. Many of you may know him as the husband to Mary Lee Bergeron, a deacon and a priest who preached from this very pulpit for many years. So we went to visit him, and while we were at his home, my little son sat stroking. He paid more attention to the cats than he did to Dr. Bergeron. But he was sitting there, and we were listening to him, and it was Dr. Bergeron who told me this story of the week after Thomas Hume's sermon that I just told you about. The week after that, when there were simultaneous Union and Confederate rallies in opposite ends of Gay Street. And we know about this from historical accounts. See, Andrew Johnson was in town and Thomas Nelson, and they were giving this rousing loyalist stump speech. So rousing that it went on for nearly 2 hours, as it was like in the day. But you know, the more things change, the more they stay the same. After about the first hour, a group of rabble-rousers out of Monroe County came down the street, as they are wont to do, a band of rabble-rousers. And when I say a band, I mean a literal band with all their instruments and marching and making noise and drowning out the other side, because they didn't have these fan-dancy speakers and microphones like we do now. So they came by, drowning them out. And we know about this because there was a rough sketch made by Samuel Bell Palmer, a young Confederate who was a prisoner of war at Camp Douglas. And in this picture, he draws Gay Street and the two ends of Gay Street, one with a rally on one side and one with a rally on the other. And that's what it was like in Knoxville, two sides in close proximity. And the years wore on, and lives were lost, and the community literally bled. You know, near the end of the war, General Burnside wrote to Thomas Humes And he also wrote to the vestrymen of St. John's Church. And he asked that Thomas Humes be reinstated to the pulpit. The vestrymen met, and they agreed. And this is the only recorded instance in the history of the Civil War where the government intervened on behalf of a clergyman and reached out, and he was reunited to his church. Thomas Humes went on to preach for many more years in our community, in our church. He was lifted up and elected to be the first president of the University of Tennessee, and so he eventually left St. John's Church to turn his attentions to establishing the University of Tennessee and establishing the Lawson McGee Library, where he held the first post as chief librarian. And he invested himself in learning and increasing learning across East Tennessee to not repeat these mistakes of the past. Last year, I was watching on my social media feeds, Facebook Live or my Instagram stories, and I was watching as there were more and more protests in Knoxville from both sides, but lots of protests, a very active political atmosphere going on around us. And there was one feed that really caught my attention. As I saw the protesters walking by and rounding the corner, I recognized the perspective of the camera person. Because the person taking the pictures of the protest was standing right on the steps of St. John's Church, right out there, in the same spot where I recognize that I stand when I greet you all after a sermon or after a day, where I greet you at the end of the Sunday, right there on our church. And it hit me. I was sitting there thinking about that, and it hit me. I had to go back and I had to look up that drawing of Gay Street, the one with those on one side and those on the other. And yes, it was there, that drawing on Gay Street. If you take a look at it and you take just a step back on the map, right in the middle, but one step removed, it's there. Actually, it's here. That's where St. John's Church is. Right there in the middle, but one step back. And here you will see below, this is Thomas Humes, below Thomas Humes, this is a quilt top that I made. It's not quite quilted yet, it'll get there, but it's a quilt top I made. And this is my interpretation of that moment, of St. John's in the Civil War, with those on one side and those on the other, and then there we are, right in the middle, St. John's Church, in the middle and one step back. But you can't put it in here that why we gather, it's not about the building, is it? The building is nice, it's beautiful. We're so lucky to have these historic fixtures and be in this beautiful historic place. But no, that's not why we gather. Our gospel today, it acknowledges that sin and brokenness and violence is always with us. But if you read all the way to the end, you see it's not the end, because you see that Christ is our cornerstone. It's not about an actual building. Christ is our cornerstone. Hebrews tells us that Christ didn't enter the sanctuary made by human hands, but entered into heaven on our behalf so that we can gather here in this place unified in Christ. That's what this place teaches us. You see, I think communities can receive wisdom and carry it into the future. And here we live in an unbroken community that has weathered the assaults of dissent and remained united around Christ. We kicked out our priest, y'all, and we brought him back. On some level, we have a spiritual muscle memory of reconciliation, for real. And that's what this quilt is about. It's about who we are, the people of St. John's. You see, we come here with our deeply held ideas, affinities, differences, well-reasoned opinions on how we pursue justice or pursue peace and where we stand. And we stand in our place when we come into this place. We stand in our place with our proclivities, whether they be red or blue or orange. We stand in our place, right? But as we stand in those convictions and as we are formed in St. John's Church, we realize that God is calling us to be humble enough, just humble enough, to stand and take a half step back to make space. To make space for one another, but also to make space for the possibility that God could be up to something in that other person. That person who came from the other end of the street. And then together, when we make that space, we turn and we approach the altar. Every Sunday, we approach the altar where we find mystical, sweet communion. A mysterious, magical unity with God and with one another. Week after week after week. Because you see, unity is not about red and blue mixing to make some middle, moderate for its own sake level of purple. No. Unity is about the regular practice of experiencing oneness in our God that allows us to stand where we are and make space for someone else. And it takes practice. That's why we keep gathering. So here is the good news, brothers and sisters. Our era is not as unprecedented as it often feels. And, good people of St. John's Church, we know how to do this. We are a spiritual community with a heritage of practicing reconciliation, of coming together week after week and being united in a way that we don't understand with our heads, that we don't have to understand with our heads. Because week after week when we gather in the altar, it is actually in our bodies that we have been, we are, and we will continue to be united in Christ. Amen.
Our service continues with the Nicene Creed, which is found on page 358 in the Red Book of Common Prayer. We believe in one God, the Father Almighty,